and welcome to my tiny office presentation of the concepts of dual coding and cognitive load. Before we get started, we're going to do a quick metacognitive activity to get us thinking about these concepts and to just bring up any background knowledge that you have. So, on your table, you're going to find a packet. The first sheet in that packet should look like this. There's two simple questions on this packet. Just fill them out to the best of your ability, and that's it. And we'll get started. We'll take a few minutes to do this, and then we'll get started. Okay, nice. So let's get started. What is dual coding and cognitive load? And why are they so important? Specifically, why are they so important to every teacher, no matter what subject you're teaching or what grade you're teaching? So dual coding and cognitive load are important because they're based off of the fundamental processes that we use to encode and retrieve information from our working memory and long-term memory. They are more fundamental than any topic or subject we're teaching. That's why it's important to all teachers and learners. So before we talk about dual coding and cognitive load, we need to take a step back and just talk about some of these important processes that underlie the importance of dual coding and cognitive load. So we have the central executive, working memory, and long-term memory. So working memory is where we process information that comes into our brain. But before that information can get into working memory, we have the central executive. The central executive decides what information gets into working memory and what information it's not going to allow or kick back out. Once information is in working memory, we make connections to long-term memory, and once we make those connections are then hopefully encoded into long-term memory. It's not 100%, but this is the process of how we encode them to those connections. And so the process of learning is retrieving information from long-term memory, making connections, encoding, and so on. Now, working memory has two important parts that we're going to focus on today: the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad. I love those names. They sound complicated. Took me a while to get used to them, but these are the important functions. And so basically, the phonological loop is where we process audio information coming through our ears, but also, and this is very important, audio information that's already in our head. So like our internal voice. And so, when we want to learn something, sometimes we repeat it over and over in our head. That is also processed in the phonological loop. So it's both external sources and internal sources. The other part we're going to talk about is the visuospatial sketchpad. Now, the visuospatial sketchpad is where we process visual information. And once again, it's not just things we see, but for example, when I hear the word apple, my brain is going to pull up a picture of a word apple that I've made connections to in the past. And that's also going to be processed in the visuospatial sketchpad. And so this is the important concept, is we're processing both external sources and internal sources at the same time in these places. And what's important to dual coding is that these things can be processed at the same time in our working memory. And that's important. That's something we'll talk about more later. But for now, I just talked about a couple of really important concepts that I want to make sure that we understand. So let's just take a minute to do a little recall activity, and for you to pull up any information, suss out any information that we've just talked about. So in the packet, again, you'll see this sheet next. It has a front and a back. I hope pretty simple instructions. We're going to work on it for about 5 minutes. I'll come around and help, and we can talk about it as well, and then we'll move on after that. All right, so I saw a lot of people writing down really good stuff. A lot of you are familiar with these concepts. Some of you are learning a little bit of new things about them. But now, these what I've talked about with these concepts and what you already know, how might these affect your teaching, or what kind of connections might you be making to your teaching in the teaching and learning of students? Let's take a few minutes to do this. All right, so we had some really good conversations, but now let's get to dual coding. What is dual coding? So dual coding is where we can use both phonological loop and visuospatial sketchpad to encode more information. Why is this important? It's important because our working memory is extremely limited. We can only process so much information in it at a time. And once new information comes in, it will kick out old information unless that information is similar or very familiar to us, or we can make connections to it. And so that's what's so important. And so when we talk about dual coding, what it's essentially allowing us to do is process more information in our working memory at the same time, essentially allowing us to make more connections and encode more information. Basically, learn more. And so that's really important. All right, so I just said a lot about what dual coding is. I want to make sure people understand it, what I've said, and basically tackle any questions. So let's take a few minutes. You have this sheet with this question. Take a few minutes to answer it. I'll come around and help, and then we'll have a discussion about it for a few minutes as well before we move on. Nice. I heard some amazing conversations. It was fun talking to you guys about this. I think you guys really got it. So, but real quickly, I'll just summarize the answer. Dual coding is using similar information to take advantage of the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad to increase the capacity of working memory. By combining similar auditory and visual signals, now, by combining similar audio and visual signals, we increase the capacity of working memory and the amount of connections that are being made when we process information. So dual coding also gives us some insight into another important concept, and that is cognitive overload, or sometimes called cognitive load. So what is cognitive overload? Cognitive overload is when your working memory has too much information coming into it. It can't process it all, and essentially it just shuts down. It just stops taking information in. And this, when it happens too much, is not good. It can lead to negative feelings about what you're learning. It could lead to negative feelings about the subject you're learning, or it could lead, even worse, it could lead to negative feelings about yourself. So, this example is perfect. Let's just take a look at it. We have a teacher, and he's teaching some more complex math. And you can obviously see that the students are struggling. But what's really bad is that you have one student who is starting to say, I just must be stupid. So they don't understand it. They think it's their fault. And then what's even worse is you have the girl who she understands this stereotype threat. She understands that there is a concept out there that girls aren't good at math. And to that verifies her reason for not understanding it. So she's thinking she's not good at it just because she's a girl. And that's terrible. And so this is what cognitive overload can lead to. So let's take a second and step through why this might happen. All right, so when we process external information, like this simple concept, apple, we take it in through in this case, we're reading a word on a page, through our visual system. But that concept is being processed both in our phonological loop, but that word is being processed as a picture because it's coming through uh, our visual stimulus. It's being processed in the visual spatial sketchpad as well. But on top of that, our brain is also making connections, bringing up information. Like in this case, we have an apple. We're bringing up a picture of the apple. So not only is the word being processed in the phonological loop, the picture is being processed along with the word. And so you see it fills up a little more of our working memory. So now we're going to take this a little bit further. So now our external source is a word and a picture. And so again, we're processing this in both the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad. But also, we're adding more information from long-term memory. In this case, we have the picture that came along with the word, but we're also making connections from our long-term memory that we've already made before that are essentially starting to crowd that visuospatial sketchpad. And so you can see how this quickly fills up our working memory. Now remember, these are simple concepts. When we're usually teaching something important to students, the concepts are not so simple. Well, they're at their level, so it's not so simple for the students. So let's take this one step further. Let's make this a little bit more like a real life situation where a teacher is trying to teach a concept. And what happens a lot is the teacher will present the external information, but then you have the teacher who's also talking as well. So all of this information is coming through our sensory inputs and going into our working memory, which is fine. But our long-term memory, the way our learning works, is bringing up information to connect to that information to try to encode it. And so all of this other information is coming up and filling up these spaces. But what's really bad is the teacher's continual conversation, talking, presenting about this is ongoing. And so at some point, all of this information could very easily cause cognitive overload, depending on how well it matches or how much time is being taken to present. And so this is very important. And this is where understanding dual coding can help us prevent cognitive overload. Okay, so I just said a lot again. There's a lot of important information in there. I'm trying to put it all together, but I want to make sure that you guys are doing all right. So let's take a minute to do another retrieval practice question. How or why does presenting information easily overload working memory? Let's take a few minutes to answer this. I'll come around and we can discuss it for a few minutes as well, and then we'll move on later. Okay, so there were some great discussions. It sounds like everybody's getting it and making some good connections to their own teaching. So really quickly, I'll just go over one example of an answer. How or why does presenting information easily overload working memory? Well, we constantly process information, both visually and auditorily, both internally and external sources, all at the same time. If the information is not already well known, these processes will easily overload our limited working memory. So how do we use dual coding to help prevent cognitive overload? That was a question a lot of you guys were asking, so let's get to it. So let's take a look at another situation. So in this scenario, you see we have a teacher presenting a concept about a water molecule. And she's got a diagram up on the board. She's got the molecule up there with the two hydrogen atoms colored red and the oxygen atom colored blue. She has a little phrase that says opposite charges attract, and then she's got a tiny diagram on the right that says H2O1, and it combines to H2O. Besides that, though, she is saying the water molecule is made up of two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. These each have different charges, and then she would go on. You can start to see, though, a problem when we think about maybe what's going on in the students' heads. So on the left, we have one little girl who is she's focused on what the teacher is saying. She's saying, okay, I got red is the small circles, and the blue is the big circles. Okay. Problem is she's way behind the teacher, and the teacher's already 3 steps ahead of her or more. Then you have the kid in the middle who says, wait, I'm hungry. Could be close to lunchtime. You never know what's going on with that student, but it's very normal for a student to be hungry. And then all of a sudden he's just like, oh, I just missed all that. And so he's way behind what the teacher said. He didn't get any of it. And then you have the girl on the right who's making an amazing connection. She's making the connection to the pluses and the minuses, and are they the same in math? And so she's making a very good connection, but still she's not focused on what the teacher is saying. We're not sure she's getting exactly what the teacher wants. And so this is a pretty common scenario. How do we use dual coding, or how would dual coding help us make this a better teaching scenario? And so when we think about dual coding, we think of making things more similar. And so in this scenario, you see that the visual is a lot more simple, especially at first, okay? And we're focused on one part of the visual. And then you also see that what the teacher says is a lot more directly connected to what's on the visual. Instead of saying the words hydrogen at first and oxygen, she's focused on, okay, we have the blue circle with the O minus and the red circles with the H plus. Okay, so just thinking, dual coding helps us to think about how to take important concepts and focus on them in a way that we're going to combine the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad in these events. Now, obviously, this is just one snapshot, and there's a lot more that goes into this. But this act of thinking of dual coding to focus on important parts of your lesson can really help students in the way that they encode information. All right, so now we've talked about cognitive overload, we've talked about dual coding, and there's a lot more to this. There's a lot more scenarios we can talk about, but essentially I'm going to put you in charge a little bit more and let you decide where to take this information. On your table, in your packet, this next chart has been made up from the research I did on these topics. And the way it's set up is there's possible overloads that a student could experience, and then the explanation of what those overloads are when you're teaching. And then next to that, there's possible problems that will be caused because of these overloads. But then there's possible solutions that teachers can take because in order to avoid these overload scenarios. So I'd like you to take about 5 minutes. You can read the chart. Once you've read the chart, you can think about it yourself. You can start to discuss with other people and think about how these scenarios might apply to your teaching and the students' learning, and maybe how you might start to use them to think about your own teaching and learning. And then we'll come to the end of this presentation. So again, take about 5 minutes, we'll talk about it, and then we'll come back. All right, that was great. A lot of you want to continue talking about this. A lot of you had some great ideas. I think some of you are already, you're like, all right, I got it. That's great. Um, so I want to we're going to end up with our metacognitive activity again. And so you're going to find the last three sheets in your packet. The first one is going to connect to the sheet that we did at the beginning. We're going to come back to those questions. You can think about the comparison of beginning to end knowledge. Then the other sheets are going to help you extend that information and reflect on the information that we did here. Take a few minutes. Whenever you're done with this, we're done. Thank you very much. I hope you got a lot out of this because I always get a lot out of this. I enjoy doing it. So I hope you got a little bit out of this as well. But one last thing before we leave is if you are interested in learning more about this, for whatever reason, because this is a very complex topic, this is all evidence-based research. The research has been done both in the classrooms and in the labs, and this is where I get this information from. I have all of the references for where I got this information. I am happy to send it to you so you can do your own research or learn a little bit more about it. All of the references I try to pull from free sources so you don't have to worry about paying anything. And again, I want this to be a learning experience for you. You don't have to, it's not just what I say. This information is evidence-based information that's going to help us all be better teachers. So thank you very much for coming. If you want to stay around and talk, I'm happy to do that. Have a great day.